We are starting the day off looking forward with a glimpse of the future of the beverage industry. What I've asked Howard Telford, who's the head of soft drinks research for Euromonitor International, to do, is to take Euromonitor's annual set of projections on beverage categories and try and create some sort of bull and bear cases, so what the biggest possible outcome could be, what a minimal outcome could be. You look at these waves and they're sort of affected by winds, by the moon, by temperature change. And here we're going to see big beverage waves and what the effects will be from external factors. Will we have a sports drink tsunami, an alkaline tide? Let's welcome Howard Telford to help us find out.
Thank you very much for giving me the chance to kick things off today. This is my first time at BevNet, and I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to the sessions later today. Just a brief word. Let me see if I can get the clicker working here. Brief word on Euromonitor. We are a global consumer goods market research provider. We operate across CPG categories, including soft drinks, beverages, and a variety of other service sectors as well. We are headquartered in London, but we have 14 offices worldwide, including my home in Chicago. We have analysts that are working and living in each of 100 different countries conducting this research, primary interviewing and secondary source research and store checking as well. In addition to that, we conduct and we publish a number of different surveys that reach industry experts. I'll share with you some of those latest findings today. And also reach consumers across 21 different markets as well. So in my brief time with you this morning, what I'd like to do is to sort of set the scene in terms of the industry performance in the US this year, hopefully giving you some reasons for optimism. And then also looking at our industry forecast model in the US, some recent industry insight surveys that we just published, and some consumer research. I want to look ahead over the next 5 years what we think are going to be the main growth categories in US beverages, to see if we can't quantify that growth potential to a certain extent, and then maybe tie things together with a few main themes that I think cut across these different categories. And my first very fundamental point, and it's a point that I think gets overlooked or it gets lost sometimes with the headlines in the industry, is just the very fundamental strength of the US beverages space. So if we look all channel, so that's alcohol plus soft drinks plus hot drinks across both retail and on trade. It's about a $450 billion industry. And it's also been a growth industry, about 14% growth in nominal terms over a 5-year period since 2012. And we don't always look at these sections of the industries together. But I think increasingly it makes sense to do so, as we see a lot of products that are blurring the lines between products. I had a chance to try one of the hard seltzers last night. And we're also seeing a lot of occasions in which alcohol and soft drinks, those occasions outside of the home in particular, are blurring as well. And when you look at it in these terms, this is one of, if not the biggest, categories in CPG. But of course, a lot has changed with regard to US consumers over the last 15 years. And what we're looking at here is growth in per capita terms, per capita consumption since 2003. And over this time frame, we aren't actually drinking a whole lot more packaged beverage. It's about the same. But there have been some big swings, obviously, in the types of beverages we are consuming. And we're looking again here at the combined mix of alcohol, hot drinks, and soft drinks. So wine and spirits, there's been a bump over this time period. And that's mainly been at the expense, we think, of craft, well, sorry, not craft, but mass market beer in the US. There's been a much bigger swing away from dairy, away from packaged juice, and certainly, as you well know, away from CSDs. And the beneficiaries have been ready-to-drink tea to a lesser extent, but above all, in terms of volume at least, it is water. Particularly still bottled water, but over the last 2 to 5 years, obviously, the growth that we've been able to see in flavored seltzers as well. It's fair to say that water isn't the only thing we are drinking. It isn't the only thing the US consumer is prepared to pay more for, but increasingly, it's the thing we're drinking the most every day. Now, the insights on this slide are they're very new. We only just got them in before I traveled out here. And this is an industry panel survey of experts that have both a global, local, and regional remit. And we found that 58% of the respondents in this survey found that their sales were going to be better in 2018 than 2017. It's an astounding level of optimism that we don't really get in a lot of the other food and beverage categories or food and beverage industries that we cover. 31%, in fact, expected their sales growth to be 5 percentage points or better in 2018 relative to 2017. And of course, there are still some major issues or challenges in the industry. The most influential factor on the businesses that our respondents in our survey were identifying was, of course, sugar reduction. And that was the number 2 factor. I don't actually have that on this slide. Was artificial sweetener avoidance. Consumer attitudes to artificial sweetener, which, as we'll see, is perhaps just as high as reducing sugar. Now, before I throw some forecast numbers at you, I just want a brief word on how we're actually doing this, how we look at forecasting across 100 different markets at Euromonitor. And essentially what we do is we estimate elasticities for a variety of different quantifiable macro demand drivers against the historic consumption that we've seen over a 15-year period in every given subcategory that we research. And so we have essentially seven sort of categories of drivers that I want to share with you here before I give you the forecasts. And the example I'll give you here is still ready-to-drink tea in the US. So obviously income. Now to keep that consistent across all the markets we look at, that's a measure of GDP, GDP per capita. We also build in something called habit persistence. We're able to calculate how consistent are habits in a given category, how likely are they to change year over year. Some categories are very volatile. Other categories have a much more consistent growth trajectory. We build in population growth. This has a fairly consistent effect in each of the categories we look at. And then intuitively, obviously, price changes at a unit price per liter level that we see in the category or forecast in the category. And then by substitution effects, what we do is we identify correlations between each of the subcategories, whether or not one trades off of the other. So an example might be lemonade carbonated soft drinks and orange carbonated soft drinks, or fresh coffee versus instant coffee in some markets has a substitution effect. We look at climate effects. As Jeff mentioned, we don't forecast the moon, but we do forecast average summer temperature or rainfall over the shorter term. We're not able to do that, obviously, over a longer term period. And then we look at specific socioeconomic relationships and the subcategories. So that could be an age band or a gender group that correlates in a given market with, let's say, younger male consumers and energy drinks is in a fairly intuitive relationship we're able to find. Or it could be in emerging markets, lower income consumers and powder concentrates is another one that we build into the model. And then because no model that's based simply on macro factors can be a crystal ball, we have to adjust based on what we know are qualitative factors that are impacting the industry. And so those are things that the marketers and the innovators in this room have the power to control. So this is specific promotions that our analysts in the field are able to identify as being significant, specific new product developments that is very disruptive in a category. And then there are a few things we have to build in that we can't control. So these would be things like sugar tax legislation in Mexico or sugar tax legislation increasingly in the US as well as from our consumer survey research, just lifestyle trends. What are consumers' attitudes to artificial sweeteners in Europe versus the US? And we try and build that in essentially to error correct what the findings that we have in the sort of macro side of that model. So with all that said, these are what we think will be the standout categories in the US over the next 5 years. These are the ones that we're very excited about. And so you can see in blue, we have volume-led growth, and then we have adjusting that for price mix. Now keep in mind, this is done at a very high category level. In a category like bottled water, there's certainly trading up and premiumization, but you might not see it at the level of still bottled water. And we're looking again here at sort of CAGR, so the compounded annual growth we expect in constant terms or volume terms over the next 5 years. You know, this is, some of these categories obviously are growing from a much smaller base than others. But if we begin with alcohol, craft spirits are certainly a trend that we've seen over the last 5 years. We expect that to accelerate in certain categories, particularly in tequila and mezcal, and also in whiskeys, specifically local blends, blends that consumers want to trial and experiment and have a story in their local community. And I think some of those flavor components, bolder, smokier flavors that you might get in some of these craft spirits, have a lot of application outside of that in soft drinks as well. In terms of hot drinks, it's a fairly slow volume growth story overall. A lot of the premiumization we saw in coffee over the last 5 years was coming from coffee pods. That is something that's slowed down a little bit in the more recent data. But we are continuing to be very excited about the growth, premiumization-led growth in fresh coffee. So craft and artisanal coffee brands, brands and flavors that we are learning about outside of the home in cafes are bleeding into retail culture as well. In terms of the dairy category, we talked a little about this yesterday. We're very excited about growth in plant-based milk alternatives, specifically the non-soy side of plant-based milk alternatives. So nut-based milks, pulse-based milks, a lot of new products hitting the market there. I'm sure you were able to try some of those at Expo West with really great flavor profiles, in my view. A lot of those plant-based milks are gaining in traction as well. As I mentioned on that slide that showed you 15-year changes in growth, bottled water is simply what we are drinking more of. That's a US trend, that's a global trend. We're finding that in emerging markets as well. This is still bottled water, added value, flavored bottled water, some of the sourcing bottled water, mineral water as well. We're very optimistic about continued growth over the next 5 years there. Now, of course, carbonated soft drinks are very difficult to tell a long-run CSDs, difficult to tell a long-run sort of volume growth story in that category. But two standouts that we see, particularly in on-trade, are going to be the mixer end of that category. So ginger ales, where there's application both as a mixer and increasingly as a standalone, more adult sparkling beverage that you are not embarrassed to consume outside of the home. And there's several different categories that touches on, but ginger ale is one of them. And then we have tonic waters and other bitters. Tonic waters, obviously, if we look at the growth of a brand like Fever Tree, you know, this is another example of a brand that has gained a lot of traction on trade, and now I think that has some application as well as a standalone, more adult craft end of the sparkling category, or sweetened sparkling category. In terms of the juice category, plant water remains the standout, as you might expect. This is where we would classify coconut and plant waters in our system. There's been some maturation in the coconut water category over maybe the last year, but it is still a tremendous opportunity. We are pretty excited as well about some of the products that we are seeing in natural and specialty channels, particularly some of those newer generation plant waters and the ability, you know, some of the maple drinks that we've been able to try, the application that those could have for sort of the new era of sparkling, which is less sugar and slightly more natural ingredients. And then finally, as you can see, the real standout in the data is brewed beverages, ready-to-drink brewed beverages. And these are two categories, RTD coffee and RTD tea, particularly RTD sparkling tea, where we classify kombucha in our data. These are categories that are making that leap outside of the nucleus of natural and specialty into mainstream channels. We have cold brew now as probably the biggest trend at the convenience show last year. So cold brew, ready-to-drink coffees of all kinds sort of making that leap into mainstream continues to be a big trend. We think that's going to accelerate. In terms of the sparkling tea end of the category, kombucha, of course, has a lot of mainstream appeal. We see that making the same sort of transition. You know, obviously fermentation in all kinds of beverages. So water, kefir, some of the shrub beverages that we were talking about yesterday. Gut health remains a very strong priority in terms of health and wellness for US consumers. So if those are the star categories that we expect over the next 5 years, what I want to look for is some common threads. And one of those is what we'll call a new daily routine. And so we can sort of map those categories, the star categories, to each of these big sort of meta occasions. Now, this is where I classify water. It's omnipresent now in our daily routine. This is where I classify the zero-calorie sweeteners, zero-calorie seltzers, excuse me, and also the growth in premium and commodity water, alongside hot coffee, which is another beverage that is in our daily routine. We consume it every day. It's our cup of coffee inside the room, on your desks now, and in cafes as well. And we think that's about $7 billion of growth opportunity over the next 5 years. The next sort of basket of goods or beverage products, the second occasion is what we'll call plant-based beverages that fulfill a specific functional role. So this is where I'd group those nut, the seed, and the pulse-based milk alternatives, certainly, where protein, in many cases, plant-based protein is a big driver. Kombucha and probiotic drinks, obviously gut health is the big driver. In terms of the natural energy drinks that many of the speakers yesterday were talking about, natural sources of caffeine, whether it's from coffee or from other herbal ingredients, is a big driver, and the list sort of goes on. We think that's about a $3.3 billion over the next 5 years. And then if we look at this final basket, this is what we'll call occasional indulgences, or a more mindful, conscious attitude to drinking and consuming our alcohol and our sugar as well. So there was an entrepreneur that was on the stage yesterday, and he had a phrase, we aren't just drinking to get wasted anymore. We care a bit more about the alcohol and the sugar that's going in our bodies, and we are prepared to pay more for elevated products, for flavors, and for experiences that are tied to those products. So this is where I would tie together the craft spirits with bolder flavors. Also ready-to-drink flavored premixes as well. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. That's a category that sort of hasn't performed as well in our last 5 years. We're a little more optimistic going forward. And then also the more sophisticated end of soda, of carbonated soft drinks. And we think that's about a $9 billion opportunity over the next 5 years, keeping in mind that a lot of that is driven by some of the craft spirits that carry the higher unit prices outside the home. And so if we have those three occasions today, we know those aren't going to be static. We know those are trends in 2018. I expect them to continue to influence sales over the next 5 years, but those trends themselves are going to change. So I'd like to speculate here on what might change in each of these sort of baskets of goods. So we know this daily routine is tied to water. But there are also increasingly a lot of beverages that are calling themselves water. When you're at Expo West, there are a lot of sessions, a lot of regulation sessions on when are we going to define natural. Well, I do wonder about how liberal we've been with that application of the term water on packaging. And I do wonder if there's a tipping point there, because consumers I think they have a very clear idea in their mind of what that means. And then in terms of sustainability issues, there's a lot of different issues tied to sustainability in some of these categories. I'm thinking specifically of single-use plastics and packaging. That is an issue that is number one, perhaps, on the agenda at the moment in Europe. I think that's on the agenda now, but a slide I'll show you in just a moment, I think that's something that's going to gain a lot of traction. I think when we think about that second basket of goods, there can be a much broader application of the role of beverages in our health. So if you look at our data from the consumer health industry, for example, we are spending a lot less on over-the-counter pharmaceuticals. We are spending a lot more on vitamins and dietary supplements and sports nutrition products that allow us to take a more proactive rather than reactive approach to our health. And I think consumers are prepared to accept food and beverages as part of that routine in a much bigger way. So we all have read about adaptogens and traditional herbal ingredients that can be used for stress relief, traditional natural medicines for immunity even, ginger teas or ginger juices with anti-inflammatory stories to tell. So I think mainstream consumers, not just natural and specialty consumers, are increasingly receptive to beverages that serve that preventative functional need, if you can tell that clear story. And I'm sorry, I'll go back to the slide here. One more thing I wanted to mention here. I mentioned that revival of flavored, ready-to-drink premixed beverages. And I think that's very closely tied to a desire for lower alcohol, lower sugar, more natural ingredients. And I'm pretty optimistic about the growth we might see in hard seltzers that sort of occupy that occasion. allow you to consume a little bit more alcohol, drink more socially, and again, going back to this idea that, I think younger generations in particular have moved past this point of just alcohol consumption as sort of binge drinking, and that this is, we are more mindful of both the sugar and alcohol we are intaking. And then the final point on this slide, and I'm excited to hear about this in the session later today. We do field a lot of questions about this, particularly from alcohol companies, but that overlap that we're seeing between CBD, THC-infused beverages, cannabis beverages, and what occasion does that displace from? Is that an alcohol occasion or a soft drinks occasion? And as we eventually go further down the path of legalization, there are some really cool and really interesting brands that are on the shelf now in Seattle and in Boulder and on the West Coast. And so I'm very excited about that session this afternoon. And as I run out of time here, I'll just very briefly look. This is what we asked our industry panel about. What is influencing your business in 2018, and what do you think is going to influence your business 5 years out? Some of these things remain the same. So sugar and sweetener reduction isn't going anywhere. That is growing in importance, according to our experts, over the next 5 years. Plant-based ingredients, clean labeling, these are all going to be familiar to you in the room. There are also some rising trends that our experts identified as being more significant 5 years out than perhaps they are today. Organic ingredient use, for example, is one thing that you can see that came up in the panel. There's also a lot of focus, as I mentioned, on sustainability. That's particularly a packaging issue, I think. That's also, as we heard yesterday, food waste. Food waste when it comes to producing brewed beverages, when it comes to producing juice, I think is something that's going to be a lot more on the agenda. I mentioned adaptogens, even things maybe we associate perhaps more with foods than we do with beverages, like FODMAP dieting and sort of the consumer desire for, or more consciousness of, the impact that short-chain carbohydrates have on our diets, particularly the sort of fruits that go into juices. Do we avoid the apples and go more towards cranberries and fruits that are more in tune with that trend? And then I'm countdown clock here, but on the consumer side, again, we have some strong commonalities. When we segment according to generation, we do see some differences. So millennials, their definition of health is very closely tied. It's inseparable from what is healthy and what is plant-based. And I think particularly when we think about how they make their own decisions and what they make as parents, what goes in the juice box over the next 5 years, I think we have to think about sort of natural and plant-based as well as sugar reduction for that trend. And then protein as well is something. The Gen Z is actually, I think it's about a 15 to 20 or 15 to 19 in our sample. It's not a huge sample in our survey, but we see very strong growth in sports nutrition beverages today. There's been some question as to whether or not that's a long-term trend, whether that has staying power, and I would suggest that if we look at the younger research, for the younger demographic, it certainly does. So before Jeff ushers me off the stage here, just a couple of takeaways. I do think it's fair to think about the end of everyday sweetness, at least in terms of growth. I think for a broad number of people, our palates have changed. Beverages that are part of our routine simply have less sugar and less sweetness overall. Therefore, your brand's proximity to water in terms of labeling, the ultimate clean label product, couldn't be more important. Those preventative attitudes to health, those will only increase over time. Beverages can play a much broader role in that. And in terms of transparency, one phrase from yesterday that Gary Hirschberg used was radical honesty. And I wrote that down because I think the consumer surveys that we use in our research suggest we read our labels, we do our research, whether it's good research or bad research, and I think every innovation is only ever going to be as good as the worst ingredient, the least understood ingredient or process in that product. And so communication really matters. And finally, when we indulge, and we do indulge, I think increasingly we are looking for new and experiential channels of trade when novelty and experience is important as the product itself. So, if you look at the combined growth of food service spending in the US, it's almost double over the next 5 years in our forecast what we're spending on retail, soft drinks, and packaged foods. So, it's a very exciting channel, what is happening outside of the home. There's some very bold, exciting channels of trade, things like food halls as well, alternative points of discovery for beverages that I think could be really, really important in how people locate your beverages. So I may have burned through my Q&A time there, but my email address is on the screen. I'm very happy to field any questions on that data.